So I'm Dmitry. I'm a co-founder of Grist. I'm also the oldest user of Grist, not in age, but in how long I've been using it. I'm here to tell some highlights of the Grist story or its history, or we might say Gristory, and I'll shed light on some mysteries, or we could say Gristories. I love these puns. They are just Gristerical. Okay, I will stop now. The history I have in mind isn't only about the past, but history in the wider sense, as a historical trajectory and history in the making. But let's start at the beginning. I'll start with an origin story that some of you may have heard, and then I'll tell a different one. Here's origin story number one. Some years ago, I worked at Google on Google Sheets, which was still in its earlier days. In the process, I became quite an expert user of Google Sheets too. And shortly after, I was involved in starting a nonprofit called New York Math Circle. And it still exists. It offers students weekend classes where they can do interesting and challenging mathematics. I use Google Sheets and Google Forms to set up a student registration flow for it. And the combination of a flexible spreadsheet and forms made it easy. But as the project grew in the amount of data and its complexity and how many people were collaborating on it, it started falling apart. There were many spreadsheets, each had many tabs. Some tasks became too time-consuming, some sheets too scary to touch, and some questions required searching for many sheets and became impractical to answer. Back then, we switched to a custom-built Django web app to replace our spreadsheets. I was the one who built it. It was a lot of work, many nights and weekends, months and years of building it. It had a proper database, but it was tedious to build, and the result wasn't actually that great. It definitely wasn't flexible. And I had to keep going back and adding little administrative features, like to filter by this or that, or export for printing, and on and on. But the spreadsheet we had before, it had been so close, and in many ways it was better. So I asked myself, can we have all the goodness of a spreadsheet, but with the benefits of a proper structured database? And that's the idea that became Grist. Okay, so that's origin story number one. It's a true story, but it's not a complete one. So let me tell you now another origin story, in some ways a more fundamental one. Before Grist became a clear idea, what was on my mind was not a spreadsheet database or any productivity tool at all. It was the idea of software you could trust. Now, everybody here in this conference understands that software is important. Actually, it scares me to think just how essential a part of our lives it has become. Not only am I talking to you all now over software, even if this conference were in person, you wouldn't know about it without software. Even to talk to people in real life these days, we need software to arrange the meeting. Our life savings rely on a bunch of records in a database in some bank. The livelihoods of many people, including myself, and probably most people in this audience, depend on our skills in working with software. But I mistrust software. It can have bugs, it's vulnerable to attacks, and it's vulnerable to ulterior motives of its maker, or sometimes of others. And there's more to say here, and I won't go into it, but for an idea of what I mean, when I worked at Google back in the day, it had a motto, "Don't be evil." And it's interesting to look up why they came up with that motto, and also why they dropped it. The point is, we all know, I think, that trust isn't a given. So when can we trust software? So in 2014, when Grist was beginning, software was moving to the cloud. Actually, much of it had already moved. There was still desktop software, but it was being left behind. Everything great and exciting and collaborative was in the cloud. But the cloud is not transparent. It reduces trust. 2014 was also not long after the NSA surveillance scandal, if anyone remembers Snowden. Part of it involved a secret program that intercepted internal Google traffic. And worse things were happening in places with actually oppressive governments. So the cloud made such erosions of trust easier and more common. And I trusted software in the cloud less than ever. So I asked myself, what would it take for me to trust software? And the first answer is simple: make it yourself. Great, right? But no, of course, that wouldn't help anyone else. So, what would it take for me to trust someone else's software? Well, there are a few properties. I'd want it to be open source. It's not a guarantee of trust on its own, but it's an important foundation. And I wanted the data to be inaccessible to the provider of the software. That means no cloud. Or if collaboration matters, cloud is okay, with end-to-end encrypted communication. Actually, end-to-end encryption was indeed getting popular at that time for messaging apps. And I thought we could do it for productivity apps too, and make it at the same time secure and convenient, including for collaborating. I thought of calling it cloudless software or sunny software. Actually, a different term gained popularity a few years later: local first, or local first software. I like that too. It's the same idea. And then I thought, what software would this matter for? I toyed with a few ideas. Perhaps people would care about their personal finance software being extra trustworthy. But all ideas were basically a database with some views of its records. So I decided this software dream is bigger than any one use case. So let's build something general purpose. So that was the dream. As you know, Grist isn't quite what this dream was, but it's very much driven by it. Grist is open source. There are some enterprise features now that are not open source. They're relatively new. They're already source available, which helps trust. Just recently, we made them available to individuals and small organizations for free. I'm still hoping even those features would get more open source, well, as long as they still allow us to have a business. It's important because it's a matter of trusting the software. Grist is not end-to-end encrypted. That would require installing an app on your device. Actually, the first version of Grist we built was, in fact, a desktop app. And since these introductory remarks are Grist history, I thought you might like to see what that very, very old version of Grist looked like. So I recorded a video for you. Looked like this. Looks pretty old, right? I think a bit of a Windows 95 look to it, I think, even though it was built a bit later. But it worked, and you can see the linked sections and kind of the features that are in Grist today are recognizable there, just before it had any UI designer who paid any attention to it. And check out this cool UI we had to link sections. It has arrows, and they show you what widgets can be connected to what other widgets. Arrows are cool. Okay. But end-to-end encryption is hard to implement, and it's even harder to be certain of its security. It's harder to use as well. We decided that we'd first release a cloud version because more people would use it. And what we did later was to package things up so that anyone can run the Grist server. And this took a lot of work, but now many, many people run their own Grist server. It turns out to have many of the same trust properties as end-to-end encryption. The software vendor doesn't have access to your data, all communication is encrypted, and the need for trust moves to whoever is running the server. And I think for organizations, it's actually better than end-to-end encryption. For individuals, we've brought back the desktop app. It works. There's a screenshot of what it looks like, but you know what it looks like. It's just regular Grist. You can get it at this URL on top. The repo is called Grist Desktop. It's open source. So with the desktop version, Grist runs on every platform: Windows, Mac, Linux. But the desktop app doesn't get a lot of our attention and is not collaborative. For individuals who need collaboration, it would be nice if the desktop app offered it in an end-to-end encrypted manner. So that remains an attractive dream, but it's challenging. Meanwhile, we are continuing to give more love to the self-hostable version of Grist. One of the big projects we are working on now is to make it easier for small organizations running Grist to set up authentication in their self-hosted instance or logins. So that's the second side to the Grist origin story, general purpose software that people could trust. There's one more side to the Grist story, the last one, I promise. A friend of mine used to challenge people with the question, what's the most popular programming environment and programming language in the world? And whatever they'd answer, he'd say they were wrong. The most popular one is Excel. Why? Because writing formulas is programming, and there are far more people doing that in Excel than there are people who even consider themselves programmers in the first place. Excel is not a great programming environment or language, but I'm not showing you this slide to make fun of it, but the opposite. Formulas do indeed make programming available to non-programmers. And it turns out that it's so very widely useful that non-technical people learn to use it, often quite successfully, even though us programmers really prefer better languages. There's a number of other ideas that software engineers rely on every day, which, if only they were made available to non-programmers easily, would be immensely useful and popular as well. So the other aspect that's been exciting to me about Grist from day one is bringing as many as possible of these software engineering ideas to non-engineers. So this slide shows Prometheus bringing fire to the humans. Is that presumptuous? Okay, it's entirely presumptuous. The legend is that Prometheus gave humans the first technology. There's more technology that would be nice to share with more humans. Actually, once I put this tongue-in-cheek slide in, I thought how software today is similar to fire. We can't live without it, but also it might destroy us all. But that will probably be the job of AI, that destroying us all. Anyway, yeah, here's some software engineering ideas that I hoped Grist would bring to non-engineers. Formulas. They are, of course, an essential part of Grist. Unlike Excel, Grist introduced Python in the cell. You can use essentially the same syntax as Excel, and your formula can still be small, bite-sized, and usually they are. But you can use the many nice things about the real programming language to do things better. Relational databases, they're just tables of records and the ability for records to be related, like point to another record. That's missing in Excel and Google Sheets, but this has definitely gained popularity for non-technical people in the last 10 years. I think every new spreadsheet-like tool out there offers some kind of relational database functionality these days. In Grist, it is very central, and I think we really managed to make it usable by anyone and reasonably user-friendly. And one other is version control. Software engineers, we rely on it daily to build software collaboratively. But in the world of data, it's not so easy. Imagine if you could work on the data on your own copy, on your own time, test and revise, ask for review, and only merge in your work once everything is right. For some use cases, this would make work much better. And also, it would make the resulting data much cleaner. Grist has long had a feature, work on a copy, which is a step towards that. If you aren't familiar with it, check it out. It's right there in the share menu. Grist also has long had snapshots that let you compare and see what changed or to revert to an old version. And I'm happy to say that some things we are working on now are taking more steps in that direction to allow people to propose changes, a little like pull requests in GitHub. I'm excited for that. In fact, I believe you will see a sneak peek of this work in the last session of today, so don't miss that one. None of these are new ideas, but bringing them to spreadsheets and making them useful to non-technical people, that's like Prometheus. That's still a work in progress, and I think it has a lot of potential. So these three stories together still drive the evolution of Grist. trust, productivity, power to humanity. Bold words, but why shy away from them? It's true. That is what we are trying to do and what excites us and me personally to continue working on Grist. That's the origin stories. The talk description for these opening remarks promised also some nuggets of advice for people building software like Grist. So let me share some of those. The first is, so this is about how we build Grist, our engineering team. The first is code reviews. Writing code is great, but getting it reviewed makes it better. For one, it ensures someone else understands what you did and can build on it or fix it when needed. For another, it forces you to write comprehensible code that someone else can understand. And for a third, as you revise your work during the review, your code gets better, so there is less time wasted finding and fixing bugs later. At Grist Labs, we spend a lot of time reviewing each other's code. If you're building a serious software project in a team, have it change reviewed. That's my advice. And if you're a reviewer and don't understand why some code is doing things in a certain way, you should ask. Maybe it's because the code really ought to be different. The next advice is automated testing. When writing software, you should write tests. There are unit tests that test small pieces of functionality. And I remember at Google, there used to be a team that would do integration tests. Someone would go through a checklist of things to try in the new version of the product to make sure that everything works as expected. These days, you can do much better by making an automated integration test. We call these browser tests, and we have many of these tests. They start up a Grist server and a browser and automatically click around the browser and check the behavior. Writing these tests takes even more time than code reviews, but for a complex product, they can't imagine living without it. In my experience, whenever some feature is missing a test, sooner or later, some other change in the product will break it, and you'll find out when users run into it and complain. So I recommend automated tests. The last nugget of advice is from working at HRT. It's a place I worked at for several years, then I left, and then I came back maybe 5 years later or so. And naturally, coming back, there was a lot more code than when I left, and I was a software engineer. So I'd go figuring out how some code works, and I'd think, gosh, why is it written this way? This is a mess, and there are no comments, and who the heck wrote this? So I would do git blame, and it would tell me that it was I who wrote it 6, 7, or 8 years earlier. And that's how I learned to write comments. The lesson is code is for humans. Computers are happy with zeros and ones, but when we write code, we try to make it clear and elegant so that humans can understand it. A good benchmark human is yourself. Think about how you'll read this code yourself in 10 years and add comments that will help you when you have no other recollection of what it was you were doing. So that's my advice for building software like Grist. Another thing I wanted to share is nuggets of advice for people building in Grist. The first is raw data is your friend. That's the foundation layer of your data. Come back to it often. It's this tool in the tools section in the left panel. You can see a list of all the tables you have in the document. You can open any one of them, and you'll see everything you have there. Are there unused tables? Do tables have clear names? You can open a table and see, do columns have clear names? Are there columns full of errors? Is there data that you really don't care about anymore? So raw data can lets you see that. The next advice is keep your Grist documents dry. That means don't repeat yourself. Avoid duplicating data or logic or structure of your document. And a particular application of it is data of the same shape belongs in the same table. For example, here I have a table of companies. Some are operating, some are closed. Don't use two tables, use a single table and add a status column. You can still have separate views or pages, like I do here, filtered by different values of status, but it's a single table. If you want your record split by location, add a location column, not a new table for each location. If you want to archive some records, add a column for is archived, not a separate table. So the data is the foundation. On top of it come views, pages, linking, formatting, and so on. When working on the foundation, think about the data. When working on the views, think about the user. Maybe the user is you. Maybe the user is your teammates or your clients or your boss. Add colors. It really helps. You can add it in choices and in conditional styles. Add descriptions. Widgets and columns support descriptions. This screenshot is from a spreadsheet makeover episode, and it shows a nicely laid out document with colors and descriptions and the nice features to make it more usable. If you don't know what spreadsheet makeovers are, it's a series of videos where Anais helps someone convert some workflow to Grist. They are a great way of seeing good examples of how to build in Grist. Actually, one of the sessions immediately after this one is a live spreadsheet makeover demonstration. And as part of thinking about the user for views, the hardest part is to remove from views things that users don't need. Remove or hide columns people don't need to look at. Remove pages people don't need. Remove or collapse widgets that aren't part of the normal workflow. There is a collapse widget in this screenshot, by the way. And this is some colors here and column description here. So clutter can make data as unusable as not having the data. If removing things is scary, try using work on a copy. You can remove there and ask your users, and that may be yourself, is this good? If yes, then you can save your changes. Lastly, I promised to share some favorite tips and tricks. One is keyboard shortcuts. I love keyboard shortcuts. Every menu shows them. Whenever I do the same action several times, I just go to see if there's a shortcut. Once I know it, that action is faster for me every time. You can see a list of all shortcuts by pressing F1 or Command/ or in Windows Control/. If you didn't know it, that's because you have to press that shortcut to see the list that shows the shortcut. That's, I guess, the circular reference error of our shortcuts list design. But there, it's circled in the slide. Also, there is a page of shortcuts in the Help Center. So here's some of my favorites. Command-Enter or Command-Shift-Enter inserts rows. I use it all the time. Of course, there's just Enter. It edits cells, also edits formulas. One I use surprisingly often is Command-D or Control-D. It fills the range with values in the top row of the range that comes straight from Excel and Google Sheets. Handy. And recently, since we added comments, I started using Command-Shift-M, which opens a comment for a cell. So these are my favorite shortcuts. Another trick I like is collapsing widgets. Here, for example, I have a list of US colleges. And there are a lot of fields for each college. So I have them shown in a card. I also have a map that shows the location of the college. But I have little space. And let's say what I normally use is table view. No problem. I can collapse the other widgets. There is an option in the widget menu. And they're still accessible at the top of the page in the area we call the attic. I can still select any college and click either of the collapsed widget names to open up the widget for that college. If you're a regular Grist user, you probably already knew that, but it's a little feature I like quite a bit. The last trick I'll show is changing column type. Here's a new table with no data in it. I can type in a couple of rows. Now let's say I want to add a numeric column. I can add it using a keyboard shortcut. Alt+ adds a column. But there isn't a shortcut to set the type. That requires opening the Creator panel, and it's too many clicks for my taste. I can do it more easily by just typing in a number. An empty column will automatically convert to the right type and even respect the formatting you used. If you want a date column, I can again add it with a shortcut, and then I can use the command semicolon shortcut to insert today's date. And along with that, it automatically turns it into an actual date type. And I can delete the date if I don't actually want this particular value. I can do the same for a date time column. This time, command shift semicolon, command shift colon, shortcut would insert the current time, and it turns into a date time. And for a toggle column, I can type in true or false, and that would automatically turn it into that type. So that's my story, my tips and my tricks, and the end of the opening remarks. Once again, welcome to GristCon.